The diner sat at the dead end of a frontage road where the streetlights gave out, and at 11 minutes past midnight, a man in a charcoal suit was leaning over a 6-year-old girl in the parking lot, telling her in a low, even voice that her mother was coming with him whether anyone liked it or not. The girl did not cry. She had stopped crying somewhere back on the highway. She stood with her sneakers planted on the cracked asphalt, and her small fists balled at her sides, and she looked past the man at the row of motorcycles gleaming under the one good light, and she walked toward them instead of away. The man called her name. She did not turn. There were 7 bikes parked nose out in a clean diagonal line, chrome catching the sodium glow, leather and engine heat still ticking off them. In the cold, a cluster of men stood near the door of the diner with coffee going cold in paper cups. The girl walked straight up to the largest of them, a barrel-chested shape in a black leather cut, and she tipped her head all the way back to find his face, and she asked the question that would unmake a powerful man before the sun came up. She asked if they were the good bikers. The man in the suit had already started across the lot toward her, fast, his polished shoes slapping the asphalt. He did not see what the question did to the 7 men by the door. He did not understand the country he had just walked into. Hold that. Her name was Dana Pruitt, and 3 days earlier she had been a waitress closing out a register in a town called Halvern, Ohio, with $211 in a coffee can and a daughter asleep in the back booth. The daughter was Maddie. Maddie was 6 and small for it, with a gap where her front tooth had been, and a stuffed gray rabbit named Biscuit that had lost one ear to a washing machine in another life. Dana had been running for 9 days by the time she reached that frontage road, though she would not have called it running. She would have called it leaving. There is a difference only the person doing it can feel. The man in the suit was named Vincent Cawley, and he was not the girl's father, and he was not the law, though he had spent the last week pretending to be both. He was a fixer. The distinction mattered, and Dana had learned it the hard way. To understand the parking lot, you have to go back to the kitchen. And to understand the kitchen, you have to understand the house on Linden Street and the man who owned it. His name was Garrett Voss. He owned the largest residential development firm in 3 counties, sat on the hospital board, and had his photograph on the wall of the county courthouse for funding the renovation of its front steps. He was the kind of man whose name opened doors before he reached them. Dana had cleaned his house for 2 years every Tuesday and Friday, and she had been good at it, invisible at it, which was the whole point of the work. You were supposed to move through a house like that and leave no trace, and Dana had moved through the Voss house for 2 years and left no trace until the Tuesday she found the thing she was not supposed to find. It was in the study, behind a row of leather-bound books that no one ever read, in a slot cut into the shelving where the wood had been hollowed out. A ledger. Not the company's official books, which sat in an accountant's office downtown, audited and clean. A second, set handwritten, in a green cloth cover gone soft at the corners. Dana had not gone looking for it. She had been dusting, and a book had not sat right, and she had reached behind it to straighten it, and her fingers had found the gap. She should have put it back. She knew that even as she opened it, she had a daughter and a coffee can and a landlord who had stopped accepting partial rent, and so she opened it the way you open a door you have been told to leave shut, because the leaving shut had started to feel like its own kind of trap. The ledger was a record of payments, names she half recognized, sums that made her mouth go dry, dates lined up against zoning votes she had read about in the local paper without understanding. A councilman who had voted to rezone 40 acres of protected wetland the same month A figure appeared beside his name. A building inspector who had signed off on a foundation that cracked within a year, his initials in the green book, under a number with too many zeros. A judge whose name was on a road on the east side of town. The road Dana had driven 1,000 times, his entry, the largest of all. Voss had been buying decisions for years, patiently, the way other men collect stamps, and he had written it all down in his own neat hand, because a man who has never faced a consequence does not believe consequences exist. The writing was the arrogance made visible. He had kept the book, not to hide it, but to admire it, a private museum of everyone he owned. Dana stood in that study with the green book open in her hands and the afternoon light coming gold through the tall windows, and she felt the floor of her life tilt. She was 40 minutes from picking Maddie up from the after-school program. She had $3 in her wallet and 40 in the bank, and she was holding the one thing in the county that the most powerful man she had ever met could not afford to have seen. The math of it was simple and terrible. She photographed 4 pages with her phone, her hands not quite steady, the camera shutters sound impossibly loud in the silent house, and she got as far as the 5th page when she heard the low, mechanical groan of the garage door rising 2 rooms away. She put the ledger back exactly as she had found it, spine flush, the dead, leather-bound books pushed in front of it to fill the gap. She wiped the shelf where her fingers had been. She picked up her cloth and her spray bottle, and she was dusting the desk, her back to the door, her heartbeat a fist against her ribs, when Voss walked into his study and asked her how the day was going. She told him it was going fine. He stood behind her a moment, close enough that she could smell his cologne, and he looked at the bookshelf the way a man looks at a fence he is not sure is still latched, and then he said the house looked good, and went to pour himself a drink. Dana finished the study with the photographs burning in her pocket like coals, and she drove to pick up her daughter, and she did not breathe right until the school came into view. That night she did not sleep. In the morning, she told herself she had imagined the weight of it, and that evening Voss called her cell phone, which he had never done in 2 years, and asked her in a warm and reasonable voice whether she had enjoyed her time working for him, and whether she understood that some things in a man's home were private. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The warmth in it was the threat, the way a smile can be a threat if you know what is behind it. She understood. She told him she understood. The next morning, Collie was parked outside her building in a charcoal sedan. He did not threaten her. That was the thing Dana would try to explain later to the men in the leather cuts, and it was the hardest thing to explain. Collie never raised his voice. He came to her door with a folder and a soft expression, and he laid out, item by item, the things that could happen to a single mother with a misdemeanor from a decade ago. He talked about Maddie. He talked about how easily a custody question could be raised, how a quiet word to the right caseworker could turn a tired woman into an unfit one on paper, and how paper was the only thing the world believed. He smiled the whole time. He left a business card with no title on it, only a phone number, and he said he would come back in 3 days to collect the phone and any copies, and that if the matter ended there, Maddie would never know anything had been wrong at all. Dana did not give him the phone. She gave him 3 days of believing she would, and on the 2nd night she put Maddie and Biscuit and $211 into a 15-year-old hatchback and drove west, because west was the direction the highway pointed and she could not think past the next exit. She had no plan. People without money rarely get to have plans. They get to have directions. For 9 days she moved. She paid cash for gas at the kind of stations where the clerk sat behind scratched plexiglass and did not look up. and she slept in rest area lots, with the doors locked, and Maddie curled under a coat in the back seat, with Biscuit jammed into the crook of her arm. She learned which lots had cameras and avoided them. She learned to park nose out, the way she had once seen truckers do it, though she could not have said why, except that facing the exit made the nights feel survivable. She rationed the coffee can the way you ration water in a desert, counting it down in her head while she pumped $4 of gas at a time. 211 became 160. 160 became 90. 90 became a number. She stopped saying out loud, even to herself. The third night, a state trooper had tapped his flashlight against her window at 2 in the morning, and Dana had come awake with her heart slamming so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Certain it was over, certain the soft-voiced man had reached into the machinery of the world and turned it against her, the way he had promised he could. The trooper had only wanted to know if she was all right, if she needed anything, and she had smiled the smile she had practiced for 2 years, of cleaning other people's houses, and said they were driving through to see family. And the trooper had nodded and moved on, and Dana had not slept again that night. She understood, sitting there shaking in the dark, that she could not even trust the help, because she no longer knew which doors the soft-voiced man had keys to. She told Maddie they were on an adventure. She made it a game the way you make anything a game for a 6-year-old, with rules and a treasure at the end. Maddie, who was 6, believed her for the first 4 days. She named the towns they passed and gave Biscuit a window seat and asked when they would get to the place with the adventure in it. Then, on the 5th day, she stopped asking, and the stopping was worse than any question, because Dana knew her daughter had felt the thing under the game the way children always feel the thing under the game, and had decided, in whatever way a 6-year-old decides such things, to carry it quietly so her mother would not have to carry it for both of them. That was the night Dana cried in the front seat with the engine off, and her hand pressed over her own mouth so the sound would not wake the back. It was the last time she cried for a long while. Crying, she discovered, used fuel she could not spare. Collie found them on the 9th day. Dana never knew how. Maybe the cash had run thin enough that she had used a card once somewhere for something. Maybe a man like Voss could simply afford to know things. The charcoal sedan appeared behind her on a 2-lane highway in the early dark, and it stayed 3 car lengths back through 2 towns. And when she pulled into the gravel lot of a diner at the dead end of a frontage road because Maddie needed a bathroom and the gas needle was leaning into red, the sedan pulled in behind her and parked across the exit. That was the parking lot. That was the 11 minutes past midnight. The 7 men by the door had ridden in 40 minutes earlier off a long run east, and they were drinking the diner's bad coffee because the next stop was 2 hours on, and the cold had gotten into their hand. They wore the cut of a club called the Iron Saint Riders, and across the back of each cut was a patch. Most people in that part of the country had learned to read like a weather warning, a winged skull above a single word that meant the same thing in every town the club passed through, which was that the men wearing it answered to no one whose authority came from a building. The largest of them was their president. His name was Roland Petrakis, and the road had called him Deacon for 30 years, because in his first year riding he had pulled a drowning teenager out of a flooded culvert and then refused to take credit for it, and a man who does a thing like that and will not be thanked gets a name whether he wants one or not. Deacon was 61. He had a full gray beard going white at the chin, hands like bundled rope, and a stillness to him that made loud men quiet without his ever saying a word. On the front of his cut, over the heart, the patch read President, and under it, smaller, a strip of leather worn pale red Deacon. Beside him stood the club's sergeant-at-arms, a lean, hard man named Theo Mraz that the road called Wren, for reasons no one alive could still explain. Wren was 44, built like a fence post with a knife scar that split his left eyebrow into two unequal halves, and eyes that did not move much and missed nothing. Where Deacon was stillness, Wren was a held breath. He had been the first to notice the charcoal sedan park across the diner's only exit, and he had set his coffee down on the railing without drinking from it again. When the little girl crossed the lot and tipped her head back and asked her question, it was Deacon she had walked to. But it was Wren who answered first with his body by turning to face the suit. Deacon knelt. It was not a small thing. A man that size lowering himself to the cracked asphalt of a diner lot at midnight, the leather of his cut creaking, until his weathered face was level with a 6-year-old's. He did it slowly, the way you approach an animal you do not want to frighten. He looked at the gap in her teeth and the gray rabbit crushed against her chest, and the way her small fists had not unclenched, and when he spoke, his voice came out of him like gravel poured slow. "That depends," Deacon said. "Who's chasing you?" Maddie did not point. She was too smart to point, even at 6, because pointing was the kind of thing that got a person in trouble. She just looked at Deacon and said, in the flat, honest way of a tired child, "The man says my mom has to go with him." My mom said run inside. But the door was locked behind her. 20 feet off, Cawley arrived. He was good at his job, and his job had taught him to read a room, and he read this one badly, because he had never been in one like it. He saw a fat old biker on his knees in a parking lot, and 6 men around him who looked, to a man like Cawley, like a problem that money or fear would solve, because money or fear had always solved Cawley's problems. He produced a leather folder from inside his coat and held it the way some men hold a badge. "There's been a misunderstanding," Cawley said, smooth as oil on water. "This woman has taken a child across state lines in violation of a custody arrangement. I represent interested parties. This is a legal matter, gentlemen, and frankly, none of your concern. Step aside, and there's no trouble for anyone." Deacon did not get up. He stayed kneeling in front of Maddie, and he reached out one rope-knuckled hand, slow, and he straightened the crushed ear of the gray rabbit where it had folded against her chest, and only then did he rise, and the rising took a long time, and Cawley made the mistake of filling the silence. "I have documentation," Cawley said, and patted the folder. "I'm sure you do," Deacon said. Dana had reached the edge of the light by then, breathing hard, and she stopped when she saw the 7 men, because for 9 days every shape in the dark had been a threat, and her body had not yet learned the difference. She looked at the bikes, and the leather, and the scarred, lean man with his arms now crossed, and a cold certainty went through her that she had run her daughter out of one trap and straight into a worse one. Then the old one with the gray beard looked over at her, and his face did something it had not done for Cawley. It softened, fractionally, the way a fist softens into an open hand. "This your girl?" Deacon asked. Dana's voice would not work the first time. "Yes," she managed. "She came and asked us a question." Deacon's eyes moved back to Cawley and lost their warmth on the way like a light passing behind a wall. "Seems only right we hear the rest of it before we answer." What happened next did not happen with fists. This is the part Dana would tell for years afterward to people who expected a different kind of story, and the disappointment on their faces always gave way to something better when she finished it. Nobody hit Cawley. Nobody touched him. Wren walked, unhurried, across the lot, to the charcoal sedan parked across the exit. He looked in the driver's window without touching the door. He read the rental tag in the windshield and the parking pass clipped to the visor, and the GPS unit still glowing on the dash with a route ending at this exact lot. And he came back and said 3 quiet words to Deacon that Dana could not hear and Collie could not see the weight of He drove here, Wren said, direct from a hotel in Halvern. Nobody assigned a custody case drives 900 miles alone at midnight. Deacon nodded once. To Collie, he said only, "Sit down, son. Have a coffee. We're going to make some calls, and you're going to wait, and then we'll all know where we stand." Collie's smile thinned. "You don't seem to understand who I work for." "No," Deacon agreed, "but I expect I will by morning." They did not let him leave. They did not lay a hand on him to keep him. 6 men simply existed between Collie and the only exit, and the existing was enough, and a man who has spent his life weaponizing the gap between what is technically legal and what is actually possible discovered, slowly, over the next hour, that the gap could be turned around and pointed at him. Inside the diner, in a back booth with cracked vinyl seats, Dana told them everything. The waitress, a heavy-set woman named Lorraine, who had worked the graveyard shift at that diner for 19 years and had seen most of what a frontage road delivers at midnight, brought a plate of fries no one had ordered and set it in front of Mattie without a word, and she topped off the men's coffee and then made herself scarce because Lorraine knew the difference between a table that wanted service and a table that wanted privacy. Dana told them about the ledger and the green cloth cover gone soft at the corners and the 4 photographs. She told them about Voss and his photograph on the courthouse wall and the phone call with the warmth in it. She told them about Collie at her door with his soft voice and his folder full of ways to lose her daughter, about the misdemeanor from a decade ago that he had somehow already known about the 3 days she had been given and the 9 she had stolen instead. Her voice shook at the start, and steadied as she went the way a voice does when it has been holding something too long and is finally allowed to set it down. Mattie fell asleep against her side somewhere in the middle of it, with biscuit under her chin and a fry still held loose in one hand, and Deacon listened with his big hands flat on the table and did not interrupt once. When she finished, the silence that swept through the booth was immediate and complete. "Show me the photographs," Deacon said. Dana hesitated because the photographs were the only thing she had, the only leverage, the thing she had carried west, like a coal in a closed hand. She had run 9 days on the strength of leverage no one had let her use, and she was tired in a way that sleep does not fix. And so she took out the phone and she showed him. Deacon looked at the 4 pages a long time. He did not understand all of it, but he understood enough, and he understood the most important thing, which was that a powerful man had written down his crimes in his own hand, because he had never once believed he would have to answer for them. Deacon had spent 61 years among men the world called dangerous, and he knew the difference between a man who breaks the law because he has run out of better options and a man who breaks it because he believes the law is a thing for other people. The first kind he could sit across a table from, the second kind he had no use for at all. "You've got a phone with 4 pictures," Deacon said. "He's got a fixer, a sedan, and a lawyer. He hasn't called yet. You know what you don't have?" Dana shook her head. "Anybody who knows where to put what you're holding?" He tapped the table once with a thick finger. "We do. Here is the thing about the Iron Saint riders that Vincent Colley never learned in time. They were not, in the way the patch suggested to frighten strangers, a gang of brutes. They were brutes when brutality was the only language a situation spoke, and the road had taught them every dialect of it. But they were also welders and long-haul drivers and a retired schoolteacher and a man named Pinball who had built and broken more secure computer systems than any 3 people in that county put together. The club ran on loyalty, and it ran on information, and the information was the part the suits never saw coming, because the suits had decided in advance what kind of men these were, and you cannot prepare for a weapon you have refused to believe exists. Pinball was the youngest of the 729, narrow and quick, with thick black framed glasses and a tattoo of a circuit board climbing one forearm. The road called him Pinball because he could not sit still, and because in his telling, every problem was just a ball you kept in play by hitting the right things in the right order. While Dana talked, he had been on his own laptop in the corner booth, and by the time Deacon tapped the table, he had 3 things ready. He had the registration on the charcoal sedan traced through the rental company to a corporate account. He had the corporate account traced to a holding company, HAT. And he had the holding company traced, after some work he declined to describe, to a man named Voss. "It's all one line," Pinball said quietly, turning the laptop so Deacon could see. The car, the account, the company. He didn't even bother to hide it. He never thought anyone would look. That was the whole of it, right there. He never thought anyone would look. It was the sentence that described every powerful man Deacon had ever watched fall. They made Colley wait in the diner until 3 in the morning. They gave him coffee. They were not cruel to him, which unsettled him more than cruelty would have, because cruelty he understood and could have used. A man who has been hit knows where he stands. A man who has been offered a refill and ignored does not. Wren sat across from him the whole time and said nothing, his scarred eyebrow unmoving, his hands loose on the table, and the nothing got into Colley, the way cold gets into hands slow, and then all at once. Colley tried twice to start a conversation. He mentioned the weather. He mentioned a contact he had in the state police, a small threat, dressed as small talk. Wren let both sentences die in the air without acknowledging they had been spoken, and after the second one, Colley stopped trying, and the booth went back to its silence. And the silence was the loudest thing in the diner. Around 2, Colley took out his own phone to call Voss, and Wren reached across the table and set one finger on the phone, not taking it, just resting the finger there with the unhurried certainty of a man who has all night, and said, "Not yet." Colley looked at the finger, and at the scar through the eyebrow, and at the row of bikes out the window catching the streetlight, and he put the phone away. Some animal part of him had begun, for the first time in his professional life, to understand that he was not the most dangerous thing in the room, and the understanding sat in his stomach like a swallowed stone. At 3, Deacon slid into the booth across from him with the green ledger's photographs open on Dana's phone, turned to face the fixer, and watched the man's oily composure curdle 1 degree at a time as he understood what he was looking at. "Here's where we are," Deacon said. "You came here to take a woman and her little girl back to a man who's afraid of 4 photographs. That's all this is. A scared man with a lot of money sent a scared man with a nice coat. And now the photographs are in more hands than yours, and more hands than his, and they're going to be in a great many more hands by sunup unless something changes." "What do you want?" Colley said. The smoothness was gone out of him. "I don't want anything," Deacon said. "Wanting things is how your boss got into this. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen, and you're going to carry it back, because that's the one useful thing you've got left to be. And then Deacon laid it out in a voice that did not rise. And the laying out was the closest thing to violence that occurred that night, because it left Collie with nothing. The photographs would go to 3 places at once. A reporter at the state capitol who had been trying to nail a development fraud story to the wall for 2 years and had never had the document to do it. A lawyer. The club kept the way other people keep a family doctor who would file in the morning. And a copy held in a place Deacon would not name, set to release on its own if anything happened to Dana or to Maddie or to anyone who had sat in that booth. Voss could spend every dollar he had, and he could not buy back 4 photographs that existed in too many places to burn. "You go home," Deacon told Collie, "and you tell him it's over. Not because we say so, because it was already. Over the day he wrote it down and the day she found it. We're just the ones telling him out loud." Collie looked at the 7 men and at the sleeping child and at the woman who had run 9 days and was now sitting very straight in the booth with her chin up, and some animal part of him understood that the arrangement of power he had lived inside his whole life had been quietly inverted while he sat drinking bad coffee, and that he was, for the first time, the smallest thing in the room. He drove off into the dark at 3:15 and did not look back, and Dana watched the taillights of the charcoal sedan shrink down the frontage road and disappear, and she felt something in her chest she had not felt in 9 days, which was the absence. But the night was not the end of it, and Deacon told her so before he let her sleep. "Men like Voss don't quit because you scared their dog," he said. "They quit when the cost of not quitting gets too high. We raised the cost tonight. Now we have to make sure it stays raised." What followed took 11 days, and Dana spent most of it in a clubhouse on the industrial edge of a town she had never heard of, a cinder-block building with a chrome-lined bar and a back room with cots, where the Iron Saint riders kept watch over her and her daughter in shifts, the way they would have for one of their own. The place smelled of old leather and engine grease, and the coffee that was always going on a hot plate behind the bar. And the first night, Dana lay awake on a cot listening to the low murmur of men talking in the next room and waiting for the fear to come, and it did not come, and the not coming kept her awake longer than the fear would have. Maddie learned the names of all 7 men inside a week. She learned that the retired school teacher, a soft-spoken man the road called Chapter because he always had a book. Chapter because she learned that Pinball could make a quarter disappear, and that the trick was in his sleeve, because she watched until she caught it, and then made him teach her. She rode the length of the clubhouse on Pinball's shoulders with her arms out like wings, shrieking with a joy that had been gone from her so long Dana had to leave the room the first time she heard it. The men built their days around the child without ever seeming to decide to. A bowl of cereal appeared at the right hour. A coloring book Dana had not bought turned up on the bar. Wren, the scarred, silent enforcer, who had said maybe 40 words in Dana's hearing, took to checking the locks twice a night and pausing each time outside the back room to listen for the sound of the girl breathing and only moving on when he heard it. One night, Maddie could not sleep, spooked by the unfamiliar dark and the strange ceiling, and it was Wren who sat down on the edge of the cot with one of Chapter's borrowed children's books, and in a voice like a gravel road being slowly smoothed flat, he sounded out a story about a balloon that got loose and floated over a town. He read badly. He stopped on the long words and started them over. He did not quit, and Maddie fell asleep before the balloon came down, and Dana stood in the doorway and watched the hardest man she had ever met mouth the word balloon a second time. To be sure, he had it right, and she understood then that she had been wrong about every threat in the dark for 9 days. and that the worst-looking door she had ever walked through had opened into the safest room she had ever stood in. The reporter's story ran on the 12th day. Quote, "It ran with the photographs, and the photographs ran with the ledger pages they came from. Because the lawyer's morning filing had compelled the production of the original Green Book, and the original book was so much worse than 4 pages. The councilman resigned. The building inspector resigned. The judge, whose name was on a road, requested early retirement and got it. And Garrett Voss, who had funded the renovation of the courthouse steps and sat on the hospital board and had his photograph on a wall, discovered that institutional power is a kind of scaffolding, and that scaffolding only holds while everyone agrees to pretend it is a wall. He did not go to prison right away. Men like him rarely do. There were lawyers and delays and motions filed in a language built to slow time, and for a while it looked to anyone watching the local news as though Voss might once again slide through the gap he had lived in his whole life. The gap had closed behind him this time. The firm dissolved, the contracts evaporating, as one client after another decided they would rather not be in the next story. The board seats vanished, the hospital releasing a brief statement thanking him for his service in the bloodless language institutions used to cut a man loose. The photograph came down off the courthouse wall one quiet Tuesday, and no announcement was made about it, and the rectangle of cleaner paint where it had hung stayed there for months, like the outline of something at a crime scene. The people who had taken his calls for 20 years stopped taking them one by one. And then all at once, and a man who had built his entire self out of other people's deference found out what he was without it, which was not very much. There is no scene where Voss begs. Dana never saw him again, and she did not want to. The begging, if there was any, happened in offices she would never enter, to people who had stopped caring whether he begged or not. The collapse was not loud. It was the quiet, total kind. The kind where a powerful man wakes one morning and the phone simply does not ring. And then the next morning, it does not ring. And on the third morning, he understands that it is not going to ring again. And that understanding, Deacon would have told you, is the only justice that ever truly lasts. The law eventually came for him, slow and grinding the way it comes for men with money. But by the time it did, it was almost beside the point. The real sentence had already been served the day the room he had ruled simply turned its back and went on with its business as if he had never been in it at all. Colley she did see once more, a year later, in the worst-fitting suit she had ever seen on him, walking out of a courthouse where he had testified about the ledger in exchange for not being charged himself. He saw her across the street. He did not approach. He had nothing left to hold over anyone, and a man like that, stripped of the gap he used to live in, is just a tired person in a bad coat. She did not feel triumph looking at him. She felt the thing you feel looking at weather that has finally passed. On the day Dana finally drove east again, back toward a life she was no longer afraid to claim, the 7 men rode with her to the county line, a clean formation of chrome and leather, 200 miles up the highway. Engines, a low collective thunder that turned every head in every town they passed. At the line they pulled off onto the shoulder, and Deacon walked back to the hatchback, where Mattie had her window down and Biscuit propped on the sill, and he knelt one more time, slow, the leather of his cut creaking, until his weathered face was level with hers. "You asked me a question the first night," Deacon said. "I told you it depended." Mattie nodded, solemn. "It doesn't depend any more." He reached out and straightened the rabbit's ear one last time. "Yeah, we're the good ones. You ever need to find us, you know where the door is." He pressed something into Dana's hand through the open window, a small enamel pin, a winged skull above a word, the club's own mark, The things strangers learn to read, like a warning. In Dana's palm, it did not read like a warning. It read like an address. "You're ours now," Deacon said. "That's not a thing we say to many. It means if the dark ever comes back, it has to come through us first." Then the 7 men swung their bikes around in the gravel and rode west, back the way they had come. And Dana sat at the county line a long moment with her daughter beside her, and the pin warm in her closed hand. And she pulled back onto the highway heading east into a morning that was for the first time in a long time. With nothing behind her in the mirror but open road, Maddie fell asleep before the next exit, biscuit under her chin, the window cracked just enough to let the wind in. Dana drove with one hand and kept the other closed around the pin for 50 miles, until she finally opened it and clipped it to the visor, where she would see it every day. And the small enamel skull caught the morning light the way the chrome had caught the street lamp on the worst night of her life. And she understood that the two lights were the same light, and that she had spent 9 days running from the only people in the country who would have stopped the car for her. She did not cry. She had stopped crying somewhere back on that highway, the same as her daughter. Her hands had finally unclenched, both of them, and she drove east with the windows cracked and the morning coming up gold over the road, and somewhere behind her the engines faded out, one by one, until all that was left was the wind. If this story moved something in you, if you have ever felt small in front of someone who mistook your quietness for weakness, stay a moment and let that feeling settle. And if it found a place in you, leave a word below so the next person who needs this story finds their way to it too.